Hi, this is Dr. Scott, and today we're going to get into a post-Nasara biblical teaching. I really want to talk to you about the parable of the talents and what you can learn from this kind of thing. Such a fascinating area. Now, some of you are listening to this. I'm going to do this on the 24th. You're probably going to hear this on maybe December 2nd, I think it is. Now, whether Nasara has happened or, the EBS to all the things are going to happen yet, in essence, I know that's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for me too. But I want you to think as if it's already occurred. And you go, well, that's ridiculous. I don't do that. Well, guess what? By the way, you do that if you're looking to get married. I mean, if you are not married right now, for whatever reason, if you think of yourself only as single and you don't prepare yourself for the mate of the future, then what you're doing is operating in unfaith. But when you start to go, you know what, I need to prepare myself for that mate down the road. Maybe I need to lose weight. Maybe I need to, do something kind of crazy like I have too much back hair and or maybe it's an emotional issue. Maybe you need to kind of say, I need to really kind of reduce my whatever and fix this portion of my life. See, that's speaking in faith toward that future husband and future wife. And that's the kind of stuff that we need to do because we're preparing ourselves for that next phase. By the way, Jesus talks about that all the time. But he says, don't worry about tomorrow, right? Because tomorrow has enough worries for itself. Focus on what you got to do today, but focus on what you got to do today, preparing for that future without worrying about it, right? So some people stick in the now so much that it depresses them. Some other people stick in the future so much that they forget about the now. There's a balance in there that you need to have. Okay? So that's why we're going to bring this up here in this kind of way. So bring it up to the screen. Really, I want you to think about monetary issues that are going to happen. What can the parable of talents teach us about wealth? Okay. What is the meaning of a talent? Now, where do we get this? I'm going to bring this back back and forth over here. So I got to kind of bring this up here on the screen. It takes me a second on the Bible study here. So let's bring this up. I like to use the Holman Study Bible. I think it's an effective way of doing this. And you're going to see actually what I do on my notes. These are things that I actually have notes about. These are huge amounts of notes. What am I using? It's using what's it called? Oh, Olive Tree Study Bible. You can get this for free. If you want to buy it, all you have to do is go into the library and buy different ones. And for instance, I bought that book, but you can have free ones, but you don't get the Strong's Concordance in there with that too. So that's like $20, right? So some people ask this question like, what are you doing? What do you buy, like that kind of thing? And this is kind of thing that I do. Now I can actually highlight that area, and then you can actually see the notes that I wrote right there. Oops, sorry, you're not really seeing that on the screen, but I'm seeing it. It doesn't show the pop-up here, but I can then make notes on that particular verse, and then I can actually highlight them there, our arguments, and I can show what was written in that particular thing and what I was thinking at the time frame. And so this is just a way that I study the word, and I study the word more than most people realize. But there's a funny thing in here I just want to show you. It's kind of interesting, and I have these things of do not understand verses. Like I'll have notes about them, then I'll kind of come back to them every once in a while. Somewhere someone says something about it, and I'm like, ooh, let's go to that verse and see if it makes more sense and God's telling me something right then. Okay? So it's kind of cool in that way to be able to handle this stuff. And it can be synced from my computer to my iPad with that too. So this is how I study the word with that. Okay, the parable of talents, and without getting too deeply into it, and I'm going to break it down. Remember, the parable of talents is backed up to an area of, see here, show you Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is talking all about end time issues. Jesus then transitions into a parable. He does a parable about the sheep and goats a little bit later. Then he talks about, and then we have the plot of Jesus, right? And so this is the separation of the sheep and goats that would happen. The funny thing is that happens at the end of the tribulation into the millennial reign. This actually is in the same kind of section. And and people have no idea. It's talking about an end time issue. It's talking about an accounting that Jesus is doing. And by the way, we're seeing some levels of that accounting right now. Okay? So to give you the basic story, if you don't know it, go read it, okay? But basically there's three dudes. One guy has 5 talents, other guy has 3, other guy has 1. And then it talks about how each one of them come back, and he's talking to each one of them. And he says, talks to each person, and he says, you did really good by taking care of them. So after a long time, the master came back and settled the accounts. He doesn't ever ask for the money back, but he settles the accounts. And then it goes through that response. Okay, so let's go back into the PowerPoint here. So sorry, we've got to bring it up here. It doesn't let me keep them all up on the screen at the same time. Okay, so what's the meaning of a talent? Because you hear this thing, 5,000, 5 talents. What in the world is it? A talent is called the tantalon. Basically talent in essence in the Greek, but it's not what like your talent to play the violin. Okay, it's a very different way of thinking about this. It's a weight of coin that you would understand is kind of your internal ability. So it's related to your ability, like you're getting it because of your capability on that. What it is that when we look at that research, it could be as much as 75 to 200 pounds of gold, of a bag of gold. That'd be like $1 to $3 million in today's value. It depends on what day we're talking about, right? We're talking about a very massive amount. Now, I think it's the New Living Translation says, one man had $5,000 and he made $10,000 with it. And for most people, that's how I learned it. And yet, when I started to understand it's a way deeper issue, guess what it really is? It's a drachma, and it is 6,000 days of a man's wage. So if you go by $48,000 a year, right, and just you basically would say, or $48,000 a year, or times that particular thing, what your salary would be in essence is about $1.1 million. So whether you weigh it out in gold or whether you weigh it out by the drachma, that's a day's earnings. So 6,000 days of a man's wage, and we're just using today's kind of wage kind of points. It's pretty close to either way that you look at that. Now, let's explain that a little bit more. The first dude has 5.5 million bucks. Now, if you haven't heard this kind of stuff, that'll make you go, whoa, hold on a second. That changes the whole, situation, doesn't it? The second dude gets 2.2 million. And the last guy, it's got 1.1. Excuse me, 1.1. All right. So the first guy brings it back and he doubles the money and he has 11 million bucks. Second dude has 4.4. He doubles his money as well. And the last guy comes back with just the 1.1. Okay. So that should change the story a little bit in your mind. All right. Now, why aren't the servants given an equal amount? Now, if you have communist, socialist leanings or fairness leanings, by the way, communism and socialism comes out of fairness kinds of things, right? But it's a real sick way of thinking about it. We would always, I joke with my wife. I'm gonna tell you a funny story. I'm gonna bring this off screen for half a second. So when we put the dogs to bed, right, we put them in their cages because they'll get out 4 in the morning and be standing in your face, kind of thing. And they're little dogs, right? So when I get cheese for them, so that they're not throwing up in the middle of the night because their stomachs are churning. I'll have these little tiny strips of cheese, right? And for the bigger dog, she actually gets a little bit more. So the big one, I'll give her 4 or 5 pieces, and then the other one's just looking at it, right? And the second one gets her strips after the first one gets it. Because the other one is older, bigger, and the second one is the younger sister, right? And it's funny because I joke with my wife when she has to do it. If I've been sick or I've been out of town, she'll joke about it. Go, I did it the communist way. I just won and won and won and won, the fairness kind of way. So again, we have been, struggling in these ideas of why wouldn't they do that that really fair kind of way of doing that. Here's the funny thing is that whether you have the 5.5 dude or the 2.2 dude, he basically says the exact same thing. Good and faithful servant, and he actually says it like this, and it's in Matthew 25:21. I'm looking over on the screen here, and it says, well done, good and faithful slave or servant. I don't people don't get all upset about slave because that means doulos. That means someone that is tied to Jesus. I'm going to give you an example. That's what we are in Christ as the bride of Christ, because of some interesting points here. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share in your master's joy. Wait a second. Slaves never share in the master's joy. What he's saying is that Jesus is not just the master, but having a share is an equal share, or we are co-heirs with Christ. That is another way of saying that you're the bride of Christ, but you don't see it all the time. But he says, dude, you did great. And to the second one, he says, you gave me 2, I earned 2 more. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into joy today, in essence. Like, whoa, that's totally nuts, right? It doesn't fit. Now, the last guy he calls foolish. Now he says, Master, I know you. I know you. Now, when he says, I know you, it is another way of explaining sexual relationship. Did you know that? When I know my wife, that means the sexual relationship that we have. Guys, the other two never stipulate that to Jesus. But this guy brings up some sexual kind of point. And Jesus is like, wait a second, we haven't done that yet. You're promised to Jesus, like you have an engagement ring, like you see young women wearing an engagement ring, holding on. They're holding out for that man because they're not married yet. And in essence, they shouldn't actually be having sexual intercourse because they're saving themselves for that moment in time. Okay, I'm not trying to beat people up about this, but this is the biblical way of talking about it. But this dude goes, I know you. You are a difficult man. He's basically going, you know what? I really don't want to be with you. You're so difficult. You take everywhere you can go. You reap where you haven't sown and gather where you haven't scattered the seeds. So I was afraid of you, went off and hid your talent in the ground. Look, I have what is yours. In essence, what the last guy does is takes off his wedding band, sets it in Jesus' hand, goes, I don't want to be married to you anymore. It's it should blow your mind when you realize that. Each one of these are betrothed to Jesus. And Jesus is telling you the story. Isn't that cool? Okay. Again, when we have that communist versus the performance-based system, it's opposite of God. It's opposite of what God is talking about. And we talked about that before. Okay, so the foolish servant buries his talent. So he says, you evil slave, lazy slave. You knew that I did all that stuff, right? You knew I gathered where I haven't sown. And he says, you could have deposited the money with bankers, and when I returned, I would have received the money with interest. And you go, that's just such a weird statement. We'll talk about that one in just a minute. But he talks about he says, I buried it in the ground because I feared loss. It's like, holy cow. Are you doing that today? Are you a bride of Christ and you're burying something in the ground because of fear, loss, misunderstanding? I mean, whatever that might be. That is not operating in the way that we need to be doing. And he says you could have at least deposited that money, right? And here's what he does. After Jesus does this, he takes the talent from him and gives it to the one who had 10 talents, or the $11 million, right? And he says, to everyone who has more will be given. We'll explain that in a second. But verse 30 says a very weird statement. Throw this good-for-nothing slave into outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, there is a famous pastor who writes a book, and I don't want to get into it because I'm not trying to beat him up here on this one point. But here's where I really disagree. He talks about how utter darkness are for Christians. And the answer is, how many Christians you know would have to be in a weak place where weeping and gnashing of teeth? You think that's a good place? For what purpose? You see, the person that is in the weeping of gnashing of teeth are always the goats. Like, now he's saying there's two groups of people there. The goat that could have been the bride and the two that were the bride. We'll get into that a little bit more. Oops, sorry. Click on the wrong area. I want to give you a little basic history of this. Banking doesn't occur until 1397, and when the Medici family does this. This is a very different time frame, and yet Jesus is talking about banking. But in the Greek, they didn't have a word for it. Here's what I want you to understand, is that, let me pull this off the screen for half a sec. But in that time frame of Jesus, this is why it's a very significant amount of money when they were given one talent or $1 million. That's a huge amount of money. You don't run around the city with $100 pieces of gold in a bag. I mean, you would just get it stolen. What they would do is take it down to the temple. I'm going to show you why this is so powerful. Jesus is looking forward in the future and talking about banking in ways that you can't imagine. And he says, at least you could have taken it to the bank and I got it back with interest. What would happen is that guy would take it into the temple. They would hold his money, utilize his money to make interest on themselves. They made money off of that thing. This is what they did in the temple. Unless he came back and he got it back with, some percentage of interest that he made just by giving it to them so that they could do their own investments. This is how they did that. So early banking was happening, but it was never a concept any other way. And it was only for the rich. Let me show you how Jesus is actually predicting banking without predicting banking. Because in 1397 was the first time we ever have this thing where the Medici family does it. It's a system of a ledger system of money in, money out. So fascinating that was accomplished at that time frame. And Jesus is even talking about it. So it's a double entry system, right? So, you have 10,000 bucks, you take out $1,000, you add in, 1,400 bucks, you take away $500, you add in $1,100, blah, 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 right? I mean, just the way of doing that. And then there would be interest added in that kind of system. And so these guys actually did it. Now, what happens is the Catholic Holy See looks at that system and goes, you know what? I want to do it. So they took it over and they took over all of banking. So banking then becomes a Catholic viewpoint. Do you see the Kabbalah influence here? This is how they do that. And we know that there are three main areas of Cabal. Cabal has Washington, D.C. for the governance, London for the banking and for the monetary issues, and lastly, the Vatican for, and by the way, all of them have their own money, don't get me wrong, but the Vatican does the religious thing. But they're all so interconnected. They move money back and forth. And this is how sick the system has been for a very long time. And so they took it over. And so the modern era, all the way from the 1600s on, we see banking change radically with that too. And by the way, the Fed banks are part of the central banking, which is a part of the sick way that Cabal has done this through the Vatican as well. Wow. And Jesus is talking about this. Now, when Jesus actually intimates this thing of weeping and gnashing of teeth, I want you to see the references. Now, I want you to take a little screenshot, and I want you to go look these verses up because I'm mentioning them here. We are mentioning them in different spots here. Now, when you see weeping and gnashing of teeth, you have to hold that as a concept out there. I'm going to pull this off the screen for half a sec here. But I want you to, when you're trying to understand scripture, it says something and it keeps utilizing that, right? And it's an analogy. Let's say I was talking about, for instance, I do another YouTube channel and we talk about, apps on your phone for hearing aids. And let's just say that I'm doing an hour-long conversation on apps, whatever that might be, right? But I reference this that this is going to be just for iPhones. So I'm going to talk about it just from the iPhone thing. Now I don't keep referencing, by the way, just for your iPhone. By the way, just for your iPhone. I've already set up the conversation that this whole thing is only about iPhones, right? So I don't have to keep referencing that. You see, when Jesus brings in the way the writing happens, when he says weeping and gnashing of teeth, you have to say, who goes through weeping and gnashing of teeth? Let me tell you, it's only the goats. In this circumstance, we see this in Matthew 13, 36 through 43. He separates the wheat from the tares. That is, the tares are the disgusting part. Do you know that the goats have always been inside of the church? I'm going to show you more about that. In Matthew 22, a fascinating area when he's talking about the wedding feast. The last one of those servants comes to the wedding banquet. He goes, by the way, friend, which means that Jesus knows him. Why'd you come without your wedding clothes? In essence, he said, why did you come here naked to a wedding? I was just at a funeral and, I didn't even know that the gentleman that had died, right? I knew had relationships with the family, the son and the daughter. And and the mom, but I didn't know him. I just didn't know him at all. And now, and a lot of people knew me there, so I was coming there to pay my respects. So I like put a nice shirt on and a coat on, right? I didn't overdress. I actually tried to figure out what it was. If people were going to wear suit, I was going to wear a suit, right? I saw a guy, and I've seen this a lot. And the guy wears like a hat. He knew the family wears a hat and jeans and shirt doesn't even tuck in. And in essence, and you kind of look at that, and go, man, can't you just dress up a little bit for this one time? Well, guess what? This is the wedding of all time, the wedding feast, which is the time where you and I get married to Jesus in this pure marriage situation. Don't you think that everyone would be dressed to the hilt for this situation? This is a spiritual conversation, right? But yet, the goat walks in naked. And it tells you a lot about that goat's characteristic. In 2 Peter 2:17, it talks about the springs without water, mist driven with whirlwind. In essence, these people have untethered themselves to the Word of God and to Jesus. Okay? And we talked about this one, Matthew 25, 1 through 13, is the wise and foolish virgins. Okay? But it also, that part talks a little bit before it, because in that particular section, we have the wise virgins and the foolish virgins. And both the foolish virgins and the foolish man here in the talents have the exact same issue. They are thrown out. They don't come to the wedding feast. And he's out and weeping and gnashing of teeth. Pretty interesting, huh? Okay. Now, I want to show you something super fascinating, because it is some amazing piece of teaching that I love doing. It's not because I'm good at it, it's because Jesus has a way of explaining things that are just outside the box. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but let's bring this up on the screen. Let's see here. Sorry, it takes me a second here. Okay. Let's look at this a little bit closer. So Jude, which is only one chapter, so is 18 and 19. These two verses I got stuck on for probably about 6 months. I mean, these are verses that I couldn't get off of. And it says, they told you, in the end times there will be scoffers walking according to their ungodly desires. Now, when you look up the word scoffer, it actually means someone who is a derider, but it calls him false teacher. And when it says ungodly desires, that is sexual desires. So wait a second. A false teacher walks according to his sexual desires is another way of saying it. Now, if you know scoffers, like professors, right? False teachers. Think about a professor who's not a believer, right? He's probably a big scoffer anyway, too. But scoffer isn't really the perfect word there. It really should have been false teacher. But again, scoffer isn't the worst word out there. It's just, I'm just sharing with you a different way of saying that. So he's saying that in the end times, which is what we just saw seconds ago, right? In the end times, we have scoffers or false teachers who walk according to ungodly desires. Oh, wait a second. Like the naked ones? These people create divisions and are unbelievers, not having the Spirit. Now, I want to pull this off the screen for a second and tell you a story that you might have heard before. But years and years ago, we were going to a church in Tulsa, and it was on it's on a Jinx Main Street, right? And neither here nor there, but it's it's a totally different place than several other places own that location. And we got there late, so we were kind of near the very, very back. Or if we weren't on the back rows, I'd be surprised. And some dude had to show up into the church, opens the door, starts screaming at the people about them parking in front of the ATM that was out there in the back. And he's screaming at, I mean, like, who would do that, right? Dude's definitely got a spirit. We could sense it from the back row. And the pastor's up there kind of embarrassed. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Now, when you think of that kind of person, that is, so you think the Bible is talking about that, right? These people create divisions and are unbelievers. That dude didn't create a division. He never created any division. I mean, he's just some guy out, a random guy. No, they actually put little cordon tape around the ATM so he could get in there. But he didn't create a division. He wasn't part of us, right? It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't something we even had to worry about other than what we were doing. He doesn't create divisions. Someone has to be inside of the church to sow in those divisions. But then it uses this word called unbelievers. Now, if you used the more correct verb, now, by the way, that is still, it's not an incorrect word to use there. But it's an odd construction of a word, because unbeliever, you would have said a pisteo, or pisteo means believer, okay? Or you say, or believe. So you'd say a pisteo. And there are other examples of non-believer. But this word here is such a fascinating word. It's called psychekos. And you go, okay, when I first looked at this is what I was looking at this verse, and I'm like stuck. And someone who is psyche, which means the soul, and psychekos, when I started to look up the etymology, which is the derivative of that word, what happened is that it comes forward from Aristotle, and he places that word underneath psychosis. Now, as a person who's dealt with psychotic patients, my wife has dealt with many more. She's a psych nurse, but I've dealt with patients that walk in the door and they get psychotic, including it's amazing. I had one woman who was actually in her first psychotic episode. It's because she was on this one medication, a medication for her mind issues. Long story with that. Maybe it was anxiety, if I remember right. And she is actively in her psychosis. I mean, she's seeing things in the world and saying weird statements. And the daughter's there, who's actually a nurse and a friend of ours. And I'm like, and I pulled the daughter. I said, she is in active psychosis right now. And they had pulled her off the medication, willy nilly, like all off at one point in time. So psychotic patients have something that's going on in the mind, electrochemical issue, or a genetic kind of level. But that's not what this is talking about, okay? It's utilizing a kind of idea of psychosis, but it's a psychosis of the spirit. Dude, think about that for a second. How do you become psychotic in the spirit? It's that you untether yourself from Jesus, like we showed you here a second ago. Let's go back to the area that we were talking about in our PowerPoint. So the goat is psychekos, psychotic in the spirit. Believers at one time, but they drained themselves of the word. By the way, it's exactly the foolish virgins who don't have any oil in their lamp. They become false teachers who are teaching inside of the body of Christ. And here's what happens. The separation that will occur after the tribulation, because this will happen in the beginning of the millennial reign, is believers from the unbeliever, or specifically the sheep and the goats. And those goats are in a really bad circumstance. And they're separated and put into outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And later on, they move from outer darkness to the lake of fire at the white throne judgment, which is after the millennial reign. Okay? So, what are some of the lessons that we can kind of come with? I gave you a little bit sidelong point here. You have an ability to use something of the Lord. Be one of those people who are the 5.5 talents or the 2.2 talents. Go and start to prepare yourself for utilizing it more effectively with that. Budget correctly. So many people, I know people who are out of debt and get really irritated at the people who are in debt, and they think they just use their money unwisely. And that's not exactly the truth. No, sometimes it is. But you have husbands and wives, and she makes, make up a number. Let's say they're both working and they both have, I mean, they have kids together, and she's let's just make up a word. She's making $35,000 a year as a teacher. He's making $90,000 in his stockbroker thing, whatever that is, right? And suddenly they break up, because she finds him sleeping around, and they go through a divorce. And instantaneously, I don't care how much he is nice to her, at least on the level of that, she is going to probably be in debt. Because if she has the kids, unless he gives her a lot of that money, and he's going to probably resist that, she is going to be in debt effectively. Now, when we see the Nasara peace that comes, that releases the debt from the people, people now need to live within their means. You who are without debt need to help the people around you who don't get it and teach them how you live within your means. This unwise practice of money that most people have come from their fear or anger. My wife will say, that people have a motivational point. Either they react in their fear or they react in their anger. More specifically, when you're in that massively stressful situation. It doesn't mean every time. It's just a possibility that people do when they're acting incorrectly. So when it talks about monetary issues, don't operate in your fear. So I know a man, older man, after his wife passed away, he gets involved with a girl, with a woman, excuse me. They're both in their 80s, excuse me, it's insane. A woman. And he's okay set up. He doesn't have any debt, but he's got enough money to be able to handle himself, right? And she, though, we find out later that she has over $1 million, and she also has her own funds, but she has $1 million sitting in the bank. And she operates with money in such a fearful way, as if she's going to lose it all. So she lives in this tiny house. It's getting old. It's by the airport. It really doesn't work very well for her. It's very loud for her in that way. But she operates in the principles of fear all the time with that money. Some people operate in that point of anger. Neither one of those really make a lot of sense. And so the other point that we would say too is build up your abilities, which leads you to a higher understanding of utilization. So what I'm saying basically is the dude with 5 talents is the guy that goes from 5.5 million and has 11 million, right? So let's just talk about the two dudes for a second here. I'm going to pull this off the screen. So one guy's got 11 million bucks. The other guy's got 4.4 million bucks. And if you are sitting there, and let's say you're sitting in the waiting room of your stockbroker, let's say, and you're picking, which one would you pick to invest your $1.1 million that you're coming into? Would you pick the guy with the 2.4 or the one with the 4.4 versus the guy with the 11? And every single time you would do the one with the 11, because too much is given, much is required. And when you operate within that, he's going to give it back to you. So that's why Jesus actually tells us in Matthew 25 there, I'm going to bring it up here, just up here for a second. He does this very unique point Let's bring it up on the screen so you like to see this as well. Always takes me a second. I have to add it into the screen with that too. So Jesus says, so take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. Everyone who has more will be given, and he who has more than enough. But the one who does not have it, even what he has will be taken away from him. And you think that's like really mean, right? The dude wasn't even a part of him. He basically said, I don't want your wedding ring anymore. I'm done with you. Well, like, fine. Jesus, by the way, did you know that Jesus never takes away the money from either the first dude or the second dude? Never takes it away. You get to keep it. But from the guy that says, I don't want to be a part of you anymore, I want to be divorced, I want to be out of here, well, guess what? You don't get the ring anymore, and you don't get the reward either. Sucks to be you. That's what he chose in that way. That's just how the Lord operates. If you don't want to be a part of him, he's fine with that. It hurts, but he understands and he operates with that response of, you don't want to be a part of it, it's fine with me. And that's what most non-Christians don't get about believers, is that Jesus looks at the circumstance. He's not pushing you to do something, but he's giving you the opportunity for that reward. Now, do you want to operate in that reward? Do you want to be more like the guy with 11 million versus the guy with 4.4? What do you want to do? Is your fear going to stop you in that way? Is your anger going to stop you in that way? I just would be really careful about how you perceive this stuff. Hope that helps you out. Thanks so much.